So I've just discovered that doing the total turnaround as I was recording right the way through the break. So I have to trim it. I have to trim that off the end of this last session as well. We're all having our cups of tea. So let's just last little bit thinking about what we can see about the period in Sinai, Horeb, which is we touched on this a little bit when we were looking at Moses first encountering God on this mountain. That Horeb, which seems to mean kind of desolate or wasted, and Sinai, which seemed to be related to the moon, and they can both be descriptions of the same place. And we looked at that kind of ridge of mountains. We're going to come back to it in Arabia. And I'll kind of say again, because it kind of keeps on coming up, I'm not in a place where I'm so fixed on this we can't change it. So I could easily, just say easily, I could find myself slipping back to a kind of a slightly more traditional route. That for me there are just a couple of things that make Arabia seem more preferable, and actually part of it, as I've said, which may not resonate for everybody, is that the descriptions of the mountain with fire on top and so on just kind of make it sound like that kind of a location. So it could kind of shift, but what we're kind of seeing. In fact, I actually intended, because this is our last session, I had a really nice quote from Kenneth Kitchen, who in the early phases I was kind of knocking for taking the wrong view on the dates, but he makes the point very graciously that actually the people who've got the most to worry are what he calls the biblical minimalists, i.e. the people who think nothing happened, because actually what you suddenly have is we have several theories to explain things, and that's actually a very positive thing, because what it means is that the story you can show fits very firmly, and the fact that people are arguing for 2 or 3 different solutions on everything isn't the problem. It's actually a problem for those that don't believe there was anything there in the first place, as to how come it fits in so many different possible ways. So the phenomena of sin, because I said I deliberately put it like that. Can we say anything a little bit more precise about where sin is? So it happened that evening that quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning, and here's the little bit I've highlighted, dew lay on the camp. It's the kind of the bit that we don't notice, because we love the story of the quail, if you know what I mean. We miss the fact that dew lay around the camp, but that they've bothered to comment on it in Exodus, because of course we're so disconnected from the nature of things. We don't see it as unusual, but they realised it was unusual, so they wrote about it. Put it that way. And I've got a little quote here just to kind of give you an idea. This is a guy who wrote a book called Travels in Arabia in 1845 and 1848. He's travelled 3 years. And he writes, dew also fell in the night, which I'd scarcely ever recollect, having observed in Arabia, but only in the deserts near the Nile. So by the Arabia, he means across all the top of the Sinai as well. He's not just talking Arabia. He's seen it by the Nile, on the shore of the Red Sea, and where he is right now when he's writing that, which isn't listed here. So we have to say, so where was George when he encountered this? Something he's only ever seen by the Nile. Well, we know the Israelites weren't by the Nile because they've left Egypt. They've moved away from the Red Sea because we've just left the Red Sea, and they've moved into the wilderness of sin. So it's not by the Red Sea. Where is he right now? He is, hang on, let's go. In the high Hisma plains, which run right up to that ridge of volcanic mountains. So this is the map that I put on. That splodge down there that looks sort of like one of those kind of dragonfish seahorse things, is the kind of the ridge of mountains. And around it, can you see the lowlands are called Tihama, and then there's Shifa in the middle, and the high Hisma, which you kind of see running from the north as you kind of run. There are some very high level plains, which are referred to as the Hisma plains, and that's where he's writing, and is a kind of a desert region, and he is surprised because he is encountering dew on the ground. Now, dew is one of those things that has very specific conditions that create it, and so you've got a certain amount of seasonality in a lot of areas. Some places that will never produce it, and others that will only produce it at certain times of the year. We know what the time of the year is here. It's around May time, because we've left around. We don't know exactly, because it's a lunar calendar and we don't know the precise year, but we know that it's roughly around May time. And around May time, actually, we do get dew in the Hisma Mountains, and we don't know of anywhere in the Sinai Peninsula where you get dew on the ground. I'm not saying there isn't anywhere, but no one's ever recorded it. So it's just one of those interesting, tiny little kind of throwaway kind of comments in the text that maybe do allow us, and actually kind of fits with a kind of a chain that's moving across and into Arabia. If they're now at this point up in those on those high plains, in that high wilderness area. So note the date. It's April or May at this point, which also coincides with the quail migrations. So again, here we have biblical writers who don't know anything about continental bird migrations. All they know is that their story says that when they were traveling through, this is the date. So it's about 2 months. Was it 2 months or was it 1 month at this stage? No, it's 1 month at this stage, because when they get to Sin. It's 1 month after the first Passover. So it's late April, beginning of May probably. The quail migrations, there's a big one which historically people have identified with, that goes through the west side of Sinai, which come up from southern Africa. Quail move up from there. But actually there's also a migration that goes from Yemen in South Arabia and comes up the coast, so up this same region. It cuts across it and then goes up the Mediterranean Sea and goes across and comes through, up kind of Croatia and into Europe that way. And it happens at around May time. And in actual fact, during these migrations, as I've got this little comment here, Arabian Bedouin have actually been reported as catching exhausted birds when they land to feed. Because quails aren't themselves necessarily long-scale endurance birds, so they're taking quite a long flight, and they stop regularly because they need to feed. And at that point, as I said, the Bedouin have learned if they're particularly tired, you can actually catch them by hand, which kind of again fits with the biblical story, doesn't it? See, that as they are coming into this area, there's dew on the ground and there are quail coming through, all happening at about the right time and season. And interestingly, some of you all know there's a huge amount of research done on manna, because there is a miracle, which is the quantity. I put it there, but manna is a known phenomena. You can actually buy it still. You can. It's now harvested in southern Italy. They actually produce the trees that actually produce it, because the way it works is it's a bit like honey, but it's not so. We're not so organised, because the insects that produce it are less organisable. But there are a number of insects which bite into the barks of the trees and drink it and process it and then excrete it. And just like bees do, they I don't know if I saw this is all quite recent, but apparently proper honey has been eaten by at least 4, probably 6 bees before you get it. It has actually, and if it doesn't, it's not actually human edible. It's kind of each time it's digested, something else happens. It's quite incredible. It's not. We used to think that just they'd chew up the nectar and then spit it out, but actually different types of bee produce a different effect in the in the thing. And this is something that's not dissimilar, which is that there are certain sweet sapped trees which get bitten into by insects, which then secrete the things, and it produces these kind of sweet flakes. Sometimes they're little beads, and sometimes they're more flaky. It depends on the insect. It can depend a little bit on the exact style of the tree. And as I said, you can actually, this is you can order these. They're a few euros. I went online, so that picture is just straight from where they've kind of industrialized the process. So they cut the trees properly to make them produce the sap and so on. So in one sense there's a natural phenomena, but of course they get a huge amount of this stuff. And the thing that's again is interesting. Was it interesting? Is tamarisk is one of the trees that you can produce manna from, which is common right the way across Arabia. So you've got that same kind of phenomena, and the Coccus maniparus, and you see that mani bit. I think the mani bit is because it actually is a bug that produces the kind of the what's thought to be manna now. Is the thing. But when it comes down to it, normally the amounts are very small. The thing of it disappearing is there are two reasons why it will disappear. Sometimes it just evaporates. Literally it apparently depends a lot on the trees, the insects, and everything else. Exactly the constituency it comes out. But it can disappear because there's a kind of an evaporation process. But equally, it will attract all sorts of other insects to eat it. And of course, remember it talks about if they leave it for a bit, it goes mouldy. You see, except on the Sabbath, yeah. So the miracle working on the Sabbath. But so in other words, it is attractive to other things to come and start chewing up. So if you leave it too long before cleaning it up, putting it in a packet and selling it.
Is there any explanation why it wouldn't go bad on the Sabbath other than supernatural?
No, supernatural, I think, is the is the thing. I think yeah, yeah, that's true. That's right. But actually, the phenomena is possible in either Sinai or in Arabia. But I've just mentioned in Arabia, tamarisk is a commentary. It is also in Sinai. So the manna doesn't tell us particularly location-wise if that is the case. If it's not just a totally supernatural bread, but I put the quantities are miraculous, whatever. But yeah, there we go. So Sinai seems to be in that kind of in those plains, and then there are a couple of other locations that they head towards, and we eventually come towards the little Mount Badir, as we thought about it, which is the volcanic mountain. The whole ridge has got certain vents and so on, but the actual kind of the real kind of winner is Mount Badir. And as you I can't remember what I've got on the slides now, so what we're going to say about it. as they come near, they stop at a place called Rephidim, which I haven't got on the slides because I was saying I was running out of time as we were doing this. But is when they're there that, for instance, Moses strikes the rock. And interestingly, well, oh yes, I've got some of the verses that highlight. You come near and stood at the foot of the mountain. I put this image up the other week when we were looking at it, but I thought I'd drop it in again. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire, and the heart of the sky with darkness, cloud, and thick darkness. That's from the description in Deuteronomy. I could have pulled out. It happened on the third day when it was morning that there were sounds and there was lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sounds of an exceedingly loud trumpet. That little phrase, I found one reference here. At noon, I heard a violent noise from a quarter of a mile off. This is a British diplomat describing the eruption of Vesuvius a couple of hundred years ago. But this issue of a loud noise. But I did find, but I couldn't find it today when I was kind of wanting to pull these together. I've got the description actually of kind of trumpet-like noises that volcanoes do produce. Because as the gas that is part of a kind of an eruptive state pushes its way through certain kind of cracks in the ground, it produces a kind of whirring sound. And so there are actually descriptions going back hundreds of years of people describing it like a trumpet sound. And we find those words here in the book of Exodus in Deuteronomy. It being described as there being like a trumpeting sound. But if this is a description of something that's got volcanic activity involved with it, it is describing using the same kind of language that's being used up until a couple of hundred years ago to describe volcanoes, but it's doing it a good 1,000 years before anybody else has ever described one. So it's just kind of drawing those things together. So the sound of an exceedingly loud trumpet, and all the people who were in the camp trembled, and Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood on the lower part of the mountain. I've got the very loud noise there. And Mount Sinai was all in smoke because Yahweh descended on it with fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked. So God comes down, but the smoke is going up, and the whole mountain quaked greatly, which again does happen. And then the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, you see. So there really is a sound. It's not just a metaphorical sound. It really does feel like it's describing a sound that goes with it. And Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice. So God is clearly meeting them. It's just, is he meeting them in somewhere that is currently going through some volcanic activity, and that's part of what has attracted them in, and will always leave as a searing memory that God spoke to them in this very dramatic way. But God is actually speaking in the midst. His voice is separate in this kind of context. So Moses wrote all the words of Yahweh and rose up early in the morning, and he built an altar under the mountain and 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. Now the reason I put that verse on is I referred to him a few weeks back, Musil Alois, who I think he was Italian, who trained as a priest, but then he went off as an adventurer and described a huge amount about Arabia. That he wrote a book called the Northern Hegaz, and he's describing Mount Bedir, and he says another sacred spot is situated by the well of Al-Hazir, and upon it are 12 stones known as Al-Madbar, the place of the slaughter, where the Beli, and these are the indigenous Bedouin tribe for this region, still offer up sacrifices when they're encamped nearby. So here in 1910, he's writing about the indigenous people at the foot of this mountain, and there are 12 ancient stones where they still go and offer sacrifice. Now again, you could say, well, it's circumstantial and so on, but it's a proper record of a region which has been touched on. We can't go and examine because unfortunately Saudi Arabia is rather sensitive to people coming and doing archaeological work in some of these regions, so we're not able to go and check these now, so we have to go back to the old writings. One of the things that's really interesting is that I discovered was that it's often said that Musil Alois didn't believe that Mount Bedir was Mount Sinai. Turns out that's not true. He did, but he was absolutely petrified of what, because of what he'd seen done to others who had previously suggested that Mount Sinai was in Arabia, and who had been so ripped to shreds by the archaeological establishment of his day, that he apparently spent years when he got back trying to do research to kind of make his case sound more solid, but never actually published it. And so he spent years actually trying to build a case to it, but he put his descriptions in, which were the reasons why he was willing to change his view, and this was one of them, is apparently the fact that there are actually at the foot of this mountain, just as was described, there are 12 standing stones, just as we read about Moses setting them up, which were still used for sacrifices even in 1910.